Good afternoon, and welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinars, our premier digital educational platform featuring a variety of interactive programs to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when and where you need it most. My name is Brian Gilbert, the Deputy Director of Events here at NCIA, and as always, I'm very excited to welcome you all to another edition of our Committee Insights program being hosted by NCIA's Scientific Advisory Committee. One final note to all the guests who are joining us for the Facebook Live at the moment, make sure to follow that short link in our video description to secure a spot in today's session, and so you don't miss out on all the interactive elements of today's programming. Now, let's get this show on the road. In today's program, member of NCIA's Scientific Advisory Committee will give an update on testing standardization in the cannabis industry by reviewing which standards are in development from international standards development organizations, while also discussing recent events that are leading to the creation of more test method standards. Well, I know our panel is eager to dive into the discussion and our audience is interested in having their questions answered along the way, so let's not waste any more time. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome one of our expert panelists for today's session, Jim Makosa, to the virtual stage to kick things off with the introductions of our panel of cannabis testing and quality control specialists. Welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials. Great to have you here today, Jim. You can activate your video feed. Oh, already got it on. You can take it away right from here.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks, NCIA, for giving us another opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been discussing in our Scientific Advisory Committee, but certainly things that we've been discussing industry-wide, obviously outside of our advisory committee as well. I'm Jim Makosa. I'm the director of Lucid Lab Group based here in Seattle, as well as CEO of Flow Technology. And really, we're a processing-based company focused on using data and scientific analytics for product development. Tiffany, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm Tiffany. I'm the Director of Quality and Processing for the Carbodex family of organizations here in Michigan. So we're licensed cannabis cultivators and processors and retail locations. Yeah. And I've been in pharmaceuticals for about 15 years and in cannabis now for going on 8. So trying to bring those best practices in, and that's why I'm here talking about quality control today. Go ahead, Luke.
All right, thank you, Tiffany. I'm Luke Mason. I'm owner and lab director of Orem Labs, located in Durango, Colorado. We're a third-party, state-certified, ISO-accredited cannabis testing facility. So been involved since 2014 with the lab. Been on the Scientific Advisory Committee for a couple of terms now, and have been, fairly involved in the development of Colorado state regulations. And with that, I'll hand it over to my Colorado cohort, Alina.
Hi, I'm Alina Rodriguez, Managing Director of RM3 Labs. I work with Lucas. We are another third-party testing lab, ISO accredited, to do all the mandated and voluntary testing for our clients before they sell products in dispensaries. I've been with the company for 5.5 years. Before that, I was doing academic research in biochemistry and neuroscience. We've been around since 2009, trying to help our clients maintain the safety, purity, and accuracy of their products.
Fantastic. So as you guys can see, we got a great panel of experts today, with really our focus being on lab testing and standardization. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. And really, our goal in this webinar, in terms of what we'll be discussing, as mentioned, is lab testing standardization, specifically as it pertains to the cannabis industry. And our objectives today for those that are here are to, one, review which standards are in development from an international and an AOAC international level. Second is to discuss recent events over the last couple of years that have led to new standards using new testing techniques. And then finally, identify the future of the industry as it pertains to lab testing standardization as more of these standards are adopted. Next slide, please. So what is lab standardization? Really, in order to do effective research, and when it comes to this, effective research, public health, customer care, and patient care, there is requirement for a comparability of laboratory results independent of time, place, and measurement procedure. Standardization in laboratory diagnostics entails the establishment of uniform test protocols appropriate for the healthcare delivery level and the selection of standard technology platforms including instruments, reagents, and consumables for each test at each level. Really, the goal of lab standardization is to, across different states that have different rules, across different laboratories, to be able to set a baseline for the testing of our products, such that at the consumer level, we know for those that are purchasing these products state by state, location by location, that there is a standard accomplished at the testing level. Next slide, please. And Alina, if you could step in here.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm going to talk about standard development organizations, or as we call them, SDOs. And SDOs are member-supported organizations that develop and maintain health and safety standards to meet industry needs. So the term standard itself it includes a variety of technical documents that prescribe rules, guidelines, best practices, specifications, and test methods. And many of the standards developed by these SDOs across multiple industries are referenced by governmental agencies as requirements in their regulations. And several government agencies and industry stakeholders have requested standards for the cannabis industry. And so the SDOs have responded by forming groups of subject matter experts to discuss the science of cannabis and to publish standards. So the first major SDO that I'm going to talk about is ASTM International. They formed a committee D37 on cannabis, and ASTM is one of the largest voluntary standards developing organizations in the world. They're a nonprofit organization. They organize volunteers and stakeholders and give them a forum to develop and publish consensus standards. So if you've ever used a baby stroller or ridden on a roller coaster, chances are those things were manufactured based on ASTM standards. And so D37 was formed in 2017. It's now up to over 900 members from 30 different countries. And we're all working together to develop standards for cannabis, its products, and its processes. And that includes test methods, practices, and guides for cultivation, quality assurance, laboratory considerations, industrial hemp devices, packaging, and security. Right now, there's 10 subcommittees in which I sit on 3 of them, the QMS, the laboratory, and the process and handling subcommittees. And to date, there's 16 published standards from this committee. Next slide, please. We'll go over some of those. So there's lab and test method standards, which include a water activity method for cannabis flower. We know that some states are already using water activity methods. Some are introducing it, like Colorado, effective July 1st. So I imagine a lot of labs will be using that standard to develop and validate their method. There's also published standards for analytical laboratory operations, for how labs actually develop and validate their methods, and for sampling before using cannabis for lab analyses. And then there is a bunch of in-progress lab standards that I hope will be published within the next few years. And those include sampling of extracts, sampling from the field, for example, for hemp, sample prep for cannabis flower for analysis, doing proficiency testing in labs, and then a bunch of different methods, including potency concentration methods, pesticide methods, terpene stability testing, residual solvents, metals, and moisture content. So as you can see, there are a lot of test method standards in the works, and we will have those hopefully pretty soon. And to get involved with ASTM, before we move on to AOAC, I just wanted to let you know you can become a member of ASTM for $75 a year and join the D37 committee. And once you're on the committee, you'll be able to see the drafts of the standards, vote on them, attend the biannual meetings where we discuss the standards at length. And then you'll get access to 1 volume of standards of your choice. So if you choose the cannabis volume, you'll get access to all of D37's final published standards under that membership. So now moving on to AOAC International's Cannabis Analytical Science Program, also known as Casp. Much like ASTM's Committee D37, Casp was formed in 2019 in response to regulators asking for scientifically reliable consensus methods for the analysis of cannabis. The major difference between ASTM and AOAC's group is that AOAC's group is focused on test methods. And the Casp community is comprised of government, academic, and private sector laboratories. And the group works together to contribute their expertise in order to develop what AOAC calls standard method performance requirements, or SMPRs. And what those are roadmaps that laboratory method developers use to validate their methods. And once those SMPRs are put in place, then it can facilitate the development of methods, because the AOAC Casp group will send out a call for methods. And so any laboratory across the world can submit their method that in which they use the SMPR to validate it. And then an expert review panel will review those candidate methods with the goal of delivering consensus-based official methods. So CASP also provides analytical and lab management training and resources for regulators as well. And there are 5 working groups based on specific topics. I sit on the microbiology contaminants group. And next slide, we'll talk about what they've published so far. AOAC has published 6 SMPRs that give labs, the recipe to validate their methods. And then there's also 2 official methods for determining cannabinoid concentration that are out there. Last year, they actually published the 2018.11 official method, which the USDA says can be used to validate the potency of hemp, which we know is a fundamental requirement of the Farm Bill program. And then actually they had an analytical method week recently at the end of April, early May, and 2 more methods were approved for potency of edible chocolates. And so to become a member of AOAC, it's an individual membership for $60 per year, and you can join a CASP working group, and you'll be able to attend the meetings, which are every 2 weeks, and help develop the SMPRs and method standards and get access to those published official methods. So now I will turn it over. We are going to, next slide, transition over to recent events leading to a call for more standardization, and I'll start with Tiffany.
Oh, thank you. It's really good to learn about those standards organizations. There have been a number of recent events that you probably have seen in the news, and we're going to cover them here on the next slide. The biggest thing that we've been seeing across the country on the testing front is failing yeast and mold for cannabis and cannabis products. As you may be aware, in Colorado, we continue to have approximately 15% year after year of all of the materials that are tested in the state are failing for microbials, often yeast and mold, but also sometimes coliforms and other such things. This is an issue because these are products before they get sold. Above and beyond that, most recent random testing was performed and reported on where material that was actually being already made for sale, so passing, was actually found to be failing after the fact 20% of the time. So even more than what was coming out originally, which is even more confusing since remediation is used very consistently in Colorado. And so even remediation activities are failing for these kind of contaminants. It's not just happening in Colorado, though. It's also happening in Nevada, where they've even been performing recalls on these products because products were found after the fact to be failing for microbial contamination, and they had to get them out of dispensaries across the state. And it's not just happening in the Southwest either. Even here in Michigan, where I'm at right now, there have been multiple recalls that have been performed over the last 2 years for microbial or other types of contaminants where people had to pull things off of shelves due to repeat testing that failed. Indeed, just this past year, there was even a hold was placed on a type of testing for checking for the the quantitative amount of yeast and molds using qPCR, where the state said, hey, we don't have enough information to say that that test is validated, and we're getting a lot of false passing data where otherwise things would have failed, and we're making it into the system, so we need to stop using that until we can be certain that that method works as far as test methods are concerned. This is important because what we're talking about today is standardization, and so in all of these cases, we didn't talk about a specific test for yeast and mold on cannabis flower and cannabis edibles that was standardized across all the states and had come to consensus. And you could think of it as a compendial method, like the other ones that were just discussed for testing potency, for instance. And because of that, there's lots of different methods, but those methods may perform differently. And you may get passing results, but you may not actually have a passing product that could potentially be unsafe. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here's a good example of another way to decide whether something is safe from microbial contamination or not, which is water activity testing, which Alina said is getting ready to go live in Colorado and is already live in other states like Michigan, where in this case, water activity is actually testing the plant material or the other form of consumable to say, is there enough water present to allow for microbial growth? Yes or no? If there isn't, well, great. It's even if you had microcontamination, as long as it remained as dry as it was when it was tested, you're never going to have proliferation. So those microbes aren't going to grow and may be able to make you sick as long as there's not enough of them, right? So they're not going to, their colony isn't going to get any bigger. It's worth noting that it's different from typical yeast and mold testing, because that is, taking the material, putting it into a plate of some sort, or and growing it in such a way to say, hey, now I've given you the perfect conditions to grow, and I'm going to tell you, how many colonies would have grown under the perfect conditions. So both of these things are trying to say something is safe for human consumption because the microorganisms are in limited supply and not able to proliferate, but they're doing it from very different directions. It is worth noting to me that one of the first methods that was out there that was standardized by AOAC was on water activity. And we also have a standard from ASTM on water activity. Both of these things already exist, and yet we, as an industry, we continue to discuss whether or not these things exist and how best to do that style of testing. This is why standardization is so important. We, as consumers, shouldn't be expected to know which kind of test needs to be performed. The industry should step in and say, okay, this is the best kind of test to make sure the product is as safe as possible, and the regulators should confirm that that test is happening every time. Now, Jim is going to talk about another recent event that you guys are probably aware of.
Thanks, Tiff. Many of you obviously have heard about, probably at this stage, especially those of us in the cannabis industry, about e-cigarette and vape associated lung illness, which has the acronym EVALI. But essentially, this was kind of center stage in 2019, especially towards the end of the year. And really what it is was vaping associated lung illnesses, where people were consuming vape products and what seemed to be unrelated illnesses. And after some studies, the CDC came out with some data linking vaping with these vape associated lung illnesses. And what they found was that 68 people were killed as of February 2020, and over 2,800 people were injured because of a result of vape associated lung illness. And after doing some studies and some comparative data, what they determined was that additives were responsible for a majority of the injuries, with vitamin E acetate being the primary culprit. Another thing they found was that vitamin E acetate has shown to be harmful when inhaled as a vapor into lungs. The unfortunate thing is vitamin E acetate is generally regarded as safe in food products. It's pretty common in many different food products that you ingest. Obviously, it's used as well as a cream for skincare, but has never been studied up until this point for its how it changes in terms of being vaped or added as a vape additives. According to one study conducted by physicians and published in Up to Date, 94% of EVALI patients showed the presence of vitamin E acetate in their bronchoalveolar lavage fluid. In other words, a fluid that was pulled from the lungs. We can go to the next slide, please. So this gives you kind of a general idea of the spread of the cases throughout the country. You can see that there, and this is again is from the CDC, and this was as of, chart was provided by the CDC as of February 18th of 2020. What you can see is obviously in concentration population densities, there were the largest number of cases: Texas, Illinois, New York, and California. And when we look at the statistics on these EVALI cases, there are a few things, a few blaring facts that stand out. The first is that 82% of cases that were reported using THC-containing products as a part of their vape protocol. So even if they were using, nicotine or e-cig based vaporizers. They were also using, in 82% of those cases, THC vaporizers as well. Out of those 82% of cases that reported using THC containing products, 78% of those reported sourcing their cannabis from a quote unquote informal source, as the CDC puts it, which they defined as a friend, a family member, a dealer, or possibly online. And what this really points out is the need, or essentially the argument for the regulated market. Obviously, testing standards in the regulated market are much different than the testing standards that you'll see in the non-regulated market. And we see this. We've seen this obviously in our state where we operate here in Washington, where before things were regulated in the medical market, only really the top companies were testing their products at a third-party analytical lab for simple things like potency. It wasn't really until the regulated market implemented at least a standard of testing required for products to hit the shelves that all these companies that wanted to sell products in the regulated market were able to, or were forced to, in a sense, meet these standards of quality before selling a product to a retail store and being available to a consumer. And if we look at states specifically pertaining to vitamin E acetate, which seemed to be the primary culprit in those vape-associated lung illnesses, here in Washington, our neighbor to the south in Oregon, and in Colorado, those are the only states that have banned vitamin E acetate as a additive in vape products. There are other regulated states that haven't explicitly banned the substance, although they have required disclosure. You have to put on your packaging and disclose if you're using those products. Testing for vitamin E acetate is still not common industry-wide. And, Lucas will go into a little bit about, kind of some of the developments in vape testing standardization. But one of the things I'd like to pull out is the data shows pretty clearly that in markets where there is this regulated component, adult use cannabis available to those that wish to have it, you see a lower number of EVALI cases associated with THC-based products. When people have access to cannabis products in a regulated market, illnesses associated with the consumption of those products goes down. And that's kind of what we were able to draw out from some of this data. Lucas?
Great, thanks, Jim. So yeah, I'm going to be going down a little story here about leachables and emissions. And I think before I do that, just to tag real quick on that last topic, if these EVALI cases had been happening in a regulated market, I think ultimately we might have gotten to an answer of what the issue was faster. Now, it's not to say it would have been completely prevented, but what really hamstrung that investigation was, at the end of the day, we have these folks that are sick, and the only samples that we had to test to try to determine what this complete unknown was that was causing, these illnesses was, we may have had just a couple 100 milligrams of fluid left in that vaporizer device. And if you take that to a lab and you want to do a complete unknown analysis, tell me everything that's in here so we can try to back out what's causing this, from the laboratory's perspective, that's a pretty inadequate sample size to be able to do that large of a scope of analysis. So just my little tidbit there on EVALI. But for leachables and emissions, I would say this is a topic that gained quite a bit of interest, probably parallel and during the EVALI incidents. But just to define those real quick, what we mean. So leachables would be, if we're talking about the context of a vaporizer device, maybe we have tested the fluid at the laboratory that would be in that final product, but it was maybe delivered in a syringe. So on its own, tests fine, passes spec. But if we add another component or an element, pun intended, to that product, is there going to be any chemical interactions between that fluid and its container, essentially? So that's kind of what we mean by leachables. Emissions testing is kind of taking that one step further. So not only are we testing it, as an intact device, but we're also going to go one step further and try to activate it. And do we collect different data measuring the emissions, which ultimately is what the consumer is consuming. So to try to tell this story and kind of get to some new regs that came out of Colorado in response to this, I pulled some just generic industry headlines. But really, this kind of started off, like I said, in parallel with EVALI. But there were news reports beginning of 2019 that California testing labs were finding pretty high levels of toxic metals in vape carts, primarily lead. So started getting some warning signs there. Progressed further through 2019. We have various states that maybe part of just kind of a blanket, let's put a hold on all vaporizer products while we figure this out. We start to see some other regulatory bodies posting guidance or putting stuff on quarantine. And then what was really interesting is that we have certain states that, okay, we put all of our vaporized products on the shelf, put them in timeout for a second. Okay, we figured out that vitamin E acetate may have been the cause of this. Let's go ahead and pull those products back out, retest them, and see if they can get back to the shelf. And what they found was they got highly variable cartridge to cartridge results, as well as different heavy metal results from the initial test, and then after sitting on the shelf for a fair amount of time. So this really brought up this concern of, should we be testing for these leachables? Should products have a more defined shelf life used by date? So Colorado responded fairly quickly to some of these concerns. One, like Jim already mentioned, just outright banning the use of vitamin E acetate in those products. But another thing that they did was they wrote into the rules that January 1st, 2020, laboratories will be required to be conducting heavy metals testing on vaporizer products on an emissions basis. Okay, so the regulators have done the easy part. They write that this is what the labs are going to do, but now here is where the benefit of having established standards could come in a situation like this. So next slide, please. So Colorado puts out this new emissions testing requirement. So from the lab's perspective, how are we going to figure this out? So if we look at what established EPA methods we have, you think about emissions testing, you think about measuring automobile tailpipe emissions or smokestack emissions out of factories or other industries, but nothing really, from the EPA kind of expected on cannabis specific products. If we look to the FDA, there are some standards, for pharmaceutical containers, some labeling or testing requirements for tobacco. But again, at the end of the day, we don't have anything that is cannabis specific, emissions testing specific on the docket. So we have these states that have all their independent thresholds or action limits, but no existing testing standards. If we broaden our sphere out a little bit though and look to the EU, they actually do have something that we can reference in their tobacco products directive regulations, which is this AFNOR specification, which does give us some requirements for how can a laboratory set up a device that will reproducibly pull off of a vaporizer or a smoked, quote unquote, smokable product, and we can collect that emission for further subsequent testing, depending on what that analyte is or what we're concerned about. So yeah, I just kind of talked about, one last thought there before we go to the next slide, please. So while Colorado has this kind of narrow scope, we're looking at vaporizer products and heavy metals testing only, I do believe that a development of a standard test method here is going to help us tremendously in the cannabis industry as a whole, even if we look to other concerns or other tests. One thing that comes to mind is pesticides. And could we use a sampling method like this to determine, on a more risk-based approach, are these pesticides safe for use, particularly with the modes of consumption that they're going to be subjected to. So with that, I will hand it back over to Tiff to give us our closing thoughts here.
Okay, so what you've probably heard by now is that there's plenty of reasons for us to have these standard testing methods so that we're all playing from the same set of rules and the consumer can be confident that the products that they're getting are safe. And the consumer needs that confidence because occasionally these products, maybe outside of the regulated market, are causing harm, and they want to make sure that that's not what's happening to them or their family members or their friends. So the biggest thing here is testing really needs to continue to evolve. There are a couple of questions that asked, hey, well, most other industries, my industry does this kind of testing up front. Are we doing that here? The fast answer is no. A lot of producers are not doing the level of research and development testing, of test method development or a validation or even process validation that you might see in, say, a food and beverage company or in a pharmaceutical company. But we should be, and not just the testing that the state requires, but testing that you would do to ensure that the product that you're making that's innovative is not creating a new unsafe situation that may cause harm to consumers, and by causing harm to consumers, harm the entire industry as a whole. It's a good idea to consider that when EVALI first started happening, there was a 40 to 50% drop in cannabis sales, vapor products across the country in regulated markets. That's a huge dip for, what is it, a $10 billion industry? It's gone overnight, like half of that. So when you consider that the people who were originally making these products using these diluents, might have had good intentions, but they didn't do any research up front to confirm that what they were doing was safe, as food and drug and cosmetics producers would have done if they wanted to use something new in their products. So one of the things that we're proposing as far as standards are concerned is that when you're creating new products, that you actually do that development process. You do the method validation with your lab. You do the stability program to make sure that your product is just as good on when it first is made as 6 months later or a year later, or however long you think it's going to sit on the shelf, and that is something that should be the norm across all industries as a standard that we create together before it goes off to the consumer. And really, we need to start doing this now, because if we keep waiting for the regulators to be reactive, at some point they're just going to tell us that we can't make these products anymore. And that's not really what we want to do. And we don't have to start from scratch because the standards organizations exist. We have sister industries that are very similar to what we do, and we can use their best practices to do that. And the more we do that, the fewer recalls we'll have, the more consumers will trust us. And the more consumers trust us, then the less the regulator has to step up and step in and hit us with a ban hammer and tell us, no, we can't do the things that we want to do, because they know that we're doing all of the due diligence that needs to be done to make sure that the products we're making are safe. So that's really how I feel about it. My final thoughts on this entire conversation would be, if anything we've said today has got you fired up on the inside, if you're like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest thing ever, or I hate this and I never want to see standards in cannabis ever, 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 it's probably time for you to be a member of ASTM and AOAC and show up to these meetings and express your views and why. Because if you're not part of the conversation what's happening right now, you will miss the boat, and changing standards after they already exist is not as easy as being part of the conversation when the standards are written. I know that a number of members of this panel are already participating in these. I know I participate in them. I'm super excited about the big working group that's coming up in July. And I feel like if this conversation has you just itching to find out more or fight the man, or both, please join us, because we need all voices. The more diversity of thought we have, the better. And I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Tiff. I echo a lot of what Tiffany says. She's our fearless leader in the scientific advisory committee. So, she obviously is like the heartbeat of what most of us feel when it comes to a lot of topics, including lab testing and standardization. And really my final thoughts with regarding lab testing and standardization as a product manufacturer and as a provider of products to product manufacturers like Tiffany is, we're always looking for the industry in a way, and specifically analytical labs that we work with, to kind of lead the charge in terms of creating a platform of standardization for testing. Oftentimes in our state, the labs here in Washington, you work with them and they do the best they can, but they have businesses to run and certainly metrics to meet. So some of the times we have to, as product manufacturers, take the initiative and encourage them in ways of that they need to improve or offer more services for, let's say, a product manufacturer like us. But to echo Tiffany's point, and I kind of finish with this, is we have a unique opportunity as an industry to set the bar for our own industry before the federal regulators step in and do it for us. And I think that's unique. Certainly it's a huge responsibility, and by having panels and webinars like the one that we're having now, and continuing to have this conversation where we impose the bar and the level of testing standardization industry-wide with the consumer, certainly I think that would be the best bet for us as an industry, and with the opportunity to do it. Luke?
Thanks, Jim. I'll try not to reiterate what you two have already spoken about too much, but I think my final thought would be just, again, that due diligence aspect of it. I find myself having conversations with clients here in Colorado where, they've kind of, maybe due to a lack of due diligence, have backed themselves into a corner where, they now have 10,000 pre-rolled joints that are not compliant, and they've gone through all the labor and the consumables to get to that point where, maybe an $80 heavy metals test up front on an R&D basis before we went down that road would have revealed that the, custom printed papers that we have with our brand on it's going to cause it to fail heavy metals. So, not just with that test or those analytes specifically, but I think just in general, would serve everyone to just, slow down a little bit. Good science takes time. Good product development takes time. Standardization and regulations take time, but it's a balance between, how quickly the industry is evolving and how quickly the regulations, testing, everything else can keep up with that. So that would be my final thought. Alina?
Thank you. So to build off what you've all said, just as a reminder, this industry is in the process of standardization, and standards are those written technical documents that we use to follow best practices, not only for testing. So I know that when we think of standards and we think of standardization, a lot of people's minds go straight to test methods and what labs do. However, there's standards for everything that a cultivator, an extractor, and an infused product manufacturer should be doing along the way as well. And I hope that any of you that are manufacturers, extractors, or growers are going to join ASTM and AOAC and help create those standards as well, because it shouldn't only be standardization of our testing, it should be standardization of all of our processes in order to make safe products.
Well put, Alina. So that concludes at least the panel presentation, and we do have some questions. So we'll kind of field through some of these questions. Alina, you actually answered this one already, but I thought it would make sense to lead off with this, because another question that Ramon asked kind of leads into what Sean asked, which is specifically in pharma, method development is common practice with regard to specific formulas and delivery system matrix. Do you anticipate this becoming a common practice with regard to cannabis edibles, where labs would need product formulations to refine testing methods and reduce noise during the analytical process? And to bring in what Ramon just mentioned in terms of his question, typical drug stability testing can be a 12 to 18 month process involving multiple batches, including the final batch and final packaging. And I think he's addressing specifically as it pertains to FDA, the FDA approval process. In final packaging, and somewhere between 1/10 and 1/3 scale, and the drug can't change at all. How do we bring this model to cannabis, where extractors probably aren't ready to throw away a 1/3 scale batch and won't be willing to wait 12 to 18 months? And to top it off, the formulations change in subtle ways from harvest to harvest. I'm in favor of the concept, but from a practical matter, how do we get manufacturers on board and willing to spend the money?
I would love
I'll
to
throw
answer
that to
that.
whoever wants to take a stab at it.
I would love to answer that, Jim. So this is Tiffany. As a processor, I'm already doing these activities. Okay, I'm already letting the batches get thrown away if things fail, and that's how it's going to continue to be when you know, for things that are produced in my facility. And I produce things in multiple states at this point. How do we get all the manufacturers on board? We all come together and agree that if we don't do these things, we're going to continue to have major failures and recalls. And recalls are expensive. They're not just expensive because you lose the batch, but you also lose consumer trust, and you lose broader consumer trust in the industry, which is bad for all of us. The second part of that is it's a 12 to 18 month process in pharmaceuticals because people want to have a long shelf life, right? That 18-month process is going to give you 3-year label claim so that you make a batch of something expensive, it sits on the shelf for 3 years and you don't have to throw it away. When you're making clinical trial materials, for instance, you can do 90-day accelerated stability so they can get a 6-month shelf life, right, from the FDA, and be able to get to market faster. A lot of the products that I work with, you don't want to consume them after 6 months, okay? They shouldn't be. The guys in the food and beverage industry, they're doing stability testing as well on their new formulations for, say, white bread. And they know right off the bat, hey, what is my testing going to be? What is this new formulation? They're making sure that it's working, that the shelf life that they're expecting is still going to be there. And their shelf life might only be 4 to 6 weeks. Or if you look at things like fruits and vegetables that are being transported, right? They do stability testing with specific kinds of transportation methods. You know, what temperature can we move this at? And if it's outside of the temperature range, you know, we know that it's not going to last as long on the shelf. And those products don't get bought by, you know, the name brand retailers. They go to, you know, farmers markets or something like that, where, you know, people are going to use the produce more quickly than sitting on a shelf at a Kroger for, you know, 3 weeks or whatever. So there are many other sister industries where we can get this kind of information from and allow us to do it. So like, for instance, in my facility, you know, if I'm stability testing on a vape product, my intention is to have all of those vape products sold and consumed within 6 months. So my stability program is based on making sure that it's safe in those 6 months. Now, if I want it to be safe for a year, for instance, because a lot of the products in Michigan have a year expiration date, then I'm going to do 12 months or 6 months stability testing on it, but not 12 to 18 months or 3 years or something like that. Right. And I'm monitoring it the entire time, and I keep retain samples so that if something strange happens, like the other day, I had a product that I kept retain samples for, and it wasn't something that was made by me, but it was something that I had for sale in my retail locations, and it turned pink. It wasn't pink when I got it, but it turned pink like 5 weeks later. I was like, holy crap. So I had to call the manufacturer, and we recalled everything from all of our customers. And we pulled it from our shelves and we sent it back to them. And we're like, hey, you guys need to figure out why your distillate just turned pink, because that's not supposed to happen. Right? You know, so those things are possible and we can do them. We just need to make the choice that we should have this level of standard and control, so that we can maintain consumer confidence in our industry. And, you know, I think there are many of us that come from these other industries that also love cannabis, and we want to see the stigma go away. And I'll tell you, my family thought it was really cool until a bunch of people started dying, and they were like, look what your company's doing. Well, of course it wasn't my company, but that's still what my friends and family were saying. And that's not what anyone likes to hear. Imagine what the people who are actually making these terrible products that were killing people feel like, right? So anyway, that's my thoughts. Anyone else?
Always fired up, Tiffany. You're always fired up. Appreciate that. Anybody else have a comment on that that particular question, Lucas or Alina, before we move on to another question?
No, I think Tiffany answered that very well.
Agreed. So we'll go to the first question, or the next question, which is from Michael Higgins, which asks, in terms of failing microbial tests, do you hear figures like Colorado's 15% failure rate to be consistent with other states' failure rates? Do you see any differences in microbial test fail rates between Colorado's total yeast and mold, et cetera, and California's other approach? Thank you. And, you know, just a quick point on that, and I'll turn it over to Alina. You know, in this state in Washington, at least as far as a couple labs that I work with here, their average failure rate is about 1.5% on concentrates and 6.5% for total yeast and mold on flour here in this state. And just to add to that, David asked, My understanding is that a lot of products are overly dried. Why do you think we are still seeing such incredibly high total yeast and mold concentration failures? Alina?
So when it comes to comparing fail rates across states, it's a little difficult because they all have different testing regimens. So just so everybody knows, I actually did an analysis of all the testing regulations across all 50 states, and 38 states actually require total yeast and mold testing. 9 states require specific aspergillus testing, and only 5 of those states require both. So for example, when you compare Colorado and California, Colorado requires total yeast and mold. They do not currently require a aspergillus speciation test. California, on the other hand, does not require total yeast and mold. They only require the speciation test. So their fail rates are going to be different. I was trying to Google find California's annual report, because Colorado puts out a 2 reports a year every 6 months, and it has data on the testing. So we actually very easily, you can find Colorado's testing fail rates. So typically every time that report comes out, it's between 12 and 15% fail rate for flour for total yeast and mold. When I was looking over California, trying to find their aspergillus fail rate, back when they started their testing programs in 2018, there's a bunch of articles that say, you know, about 20% of the products in total fail for something. Most of those, the majority of those, 65% of those are actually fails for potency labeling. So the other 35% are contaminant fails. And it seems to me that probably about 6% of those batches back in 2018 were failing for contaminant testing. Now, we don't know the breakdown of aspergillus versus total yeast and mold fail rates for all states, like I'm mentioning. So and to David's question, a lot of products being overly dried. Why do you think we're still seeing high total yeast and mold failures? Well, it's a plant, and obviously you're going to have yeast and mold, which is ubiquitous in our environment, is going to be a part of that biome, more than likely. Our limit of 10,000 CFU per gram is pretty low considerably, since visible mold isn't actually seen until you're into the 10 to the 8 CFU per gram range. So my thought would be, flour that it's overly dried, that's seeing a water activity measurement of 0.55, which is at the lower end of what ASTM specifies for flour, is that before it was dried, the mold was there. And so just because it got overly dried, it just means the mold no longer has any free available water to use to continue growing. But it takes a lot to kill off that mold. If you're just letting it sit there, it might be able to just survive for a while. And it just depends on the timelines of your testing of when that's occurring. But my idea would be, if your water activity is that low, hopefully if your result, let's say, is 8,000 CFU per gram on your batch, that it won't continue to grow. That's the idea for water activity testing, versus if you have something that is 8,000 CFU per gram, but your water activity is 0.7, that if that sits in a dispensary for a month, it's going to fail if it gets pulled off and retested.
Luke, like to add anything?
No, I think that was a pretty succinct answer there. I mean, I think the only thing about, Colorado's rate specifically in that 15% is you might have a different fail rate if you go and actually pull products off the shelf. So that 15% number does come from, just straight out of the, metric test records. And I think it is important to note that Colorado is a self-sampling state. We don't have lab representatives collecting the samples, or independent third parties collecting the samples. And at least in my mind, there is always a question of, is what we're testing representative of what the consumer is getting? And that may or may not always be the case.
Succinct answers from the panel, no doubt. And obviously, if you guys want to reach out to the panelists individually to have ongoing conversations, contact information is in the presentation. Let's move to the next question here from Sean Arnold, which was specifically pertaining to process validation. Do you foresee testing to be broken into categories in the future? For example, product development and process validation, including shelf life, package compatibility, toxicity, etc., versus batch testing, which ensures product safety. And I just make a quick point before I turn this over to Tiffany. This is something as a product manufacturer and as somebody who works with product manufacturers to provide them, things like infused ingredients and input extract. We've had to do some of this testing in-house in terms of product stability testing and working with third parties. Because this is some of this testing is relatively new to the cannabis industry in terms of particle size analysis, data potential, product stability, etc. But a lot of companies, especially the larger, more well-established ones, do make some of this practice internally. Tiffany?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. So thank you, Sean, for bringing it up to the broader audience here. Yes, yes, people are doing it. I'm doing it. I'm doing it at the companies I've been working with for a bit now. And the regulators are catching up to this as well. So for example, here in Michigan, they said we can make beverages, which is awesome because we can't make beverages until they said we could earlier this year. But in order for us to make those beverages, we have to go through a lot of process development testing, convince the MRA that our product is safe, and shelf stability testing on it, and then maintain continuous shelf stability on it while it's in the field as a batch-to-batch test. So, at least for infused drinks that will be produced in the Michigan market, the regulators have caught up to where we might be if we were self-regulating and are saying, yeah, we have to do this activity. I feel like other places are going to keep doing that, especially if we keep having larger recalls where we're seeing products with discoloration or settling, or we're, and it's not even going to be because the products themselves are necessarily unsafe, but because the product becomes aesthetically unpleasing, because it doesn't look nice, because it doesn't taste good, because it smells funny. And the consumer says, ooh, I don't like that. I don't want that. And once they say that enough, the producers of these products will say, oh, we better do something about that or we're going to lose market share. And I feel like for some of the people that I work with already, because I do work with brands from across the country, bringing them here to Michigan and previously in Arizona, those brands are already making those decisions and they're already putting these things in place. So if you're just starting out and you're a producer, know that the multi-state operators are already thinking about this. They're already doing it. So make sure you're thinking about it too, so that you're not behind.
And I'd add a little bit to that is that the question, was comparing process validation and like testing and monitoring and verifying your whole process, before you reach the final product versus what most states are doing right now, which is like a one-size-fits-all mandated testing program. And so there's actually 2 states already that don't have one of those. What they say is that much like all other industries use GMP, they have to develop a risk assessment for each particular product and figure out the risks of their products and figure out where along their manufacturing process they're going to actually monitor and test and verify, and then whether they're going to do intermediate testing or final batch testing as well, and how often they're going to do that. And then other states like Colorado, we've been doing that mandated testing program for a long time now, and we have been discussing for the past couple of years, and hopefully we'll be closer next year to proposing a little more of a GMP style testing program, because I think the mandated testing programs in cannabis really just make the manufacturers and the cultivators focus on just, can I pass the final test, right? They're not thinking about all the risks along the way. They're not thinking about if they sanitize their tools and their machines, that they actually verify and validate that sanitation process actually works, right? They're just waiting till the end product to figure out if it got contaminated. So we're hoping that, we don't want to reinvent the wheel as an industry, and the food, environmental, pharmaceutical industries already use these kinds of process validation tools and not just final batch testing.
And it's worth noting that for me, I went from not doing it because I worked at places that didn't require it in the past to always doing it. And, used to fail 15%, 20% of the time. And now we don't fail, right? Because we built the quality in up front and we're monitoring throughout. So, the first time you fail on a 10-kilo batch for heavy metals and you're like, crap, now I have to remediate this and I can't make the sale that I needed to make to someone, or I can't fill those cartridges that I already have pre-sold to someone else, because now I have to remediate that heavy metals out. You'll remember to build in process checks and making sure all your components are correct, because it really, I've had that happen. I know what it feels like to not be able to make a sale and lose customer confidence in my company because of those kinds of things. right? So make a good decision so that you're not impacted by this kind of stuff.
Absolutely, Tiffany. Just a little anecdote before the last question here is, way back when we first started, where, I didn't even know, we were spot checking pesticide tests, but they weren't required. And we were, pushing out vapes in 2015, 2016, like it was going out of style because it was so new and so many people liked it. And a retail store spot checked some of our vape products, and they failed for one pesticide from one batch of products that I sourced outside of our own grow that we made. And, we lost a tremendous amount of customers. And I remember, specifically getting the phone call. I remember exactly where I was going to see a customer. And I remember it hit me right in the heart to think that, we failed for this thing that we weren't testing for, that a customer tested for, not because it was a requirement, but because they cared about what their customers, what they were putting into their customers in terms of the products we were offering. And it hit me right in the chest and really taught me a very important lesson, not only the one where you lose money, which I hope you guys don't ever, as product manufacturers, come into that type of lesson. But, as a product manufacturer, we have a responsibility to set a really, really high bar for the types of products that we want to put out there. And even though a certain type of testing may not be required, if you know that there are opportunities to test your products and create a QC metric, both on the testing and on the product manufacturing side, that is going to lead to a cleaner, safer product for your consumers, that's something that you should incorporate into your process. And, as product manufacturers, certainly there's a responsibility there. We got a couple minutes left, and I want to address this last question because I think it's important. We touched on it a couple times, and that is our remediation failures. And this was from Mike Higgins. In parenthesis, attempting to clean a product, quote unquote, for retesting, pointing to some remediation technologies being better than others. If so, which remediation methods are proving to be more successful? Thank you. As a product manufacturer, we learned over time, it's better to make sure that certain things don't need to be, aren't in your product, as opposed to it being there and you need to remediate it out. But that's not always the case. If anyone would like to tackle that, please do.
I could throw something in here because I do get asked this question quite a bit. It's sort of the natural next question from a client. Total use of mold failure is, one is, what did I fail for? And then what do you recommend I do to clean it up? I always start that question with, or the answer with, it ultimately depends on, what your individual environment or production environment is. So, if you're a small kind of boutique indoor grower, I would argue your money is better spent on prevention than back-end remediation. But as you start to scale up or you move outdoors, you're in a greenhouse or whatnot, you probably don't have many mechanisms you can do to totally protect yourself. And you might be looking at, more of a remediation situation. So I don't have any particular technique that is favored over the others. Maybe Tiffany or Elena can speak to that.
Yeah, I've successfully used X-ray and microwave irradiation to get between a 3 and a 6 log reduction in the presence of microbial contamination on flour. For everything else that I've made and that I continue to make, I use a lot of heat and filtration to remove micro contamination. So I'm killing things and then I'm removing the bodies. And that's built into my process from the very beginning. So it's going to get filtered at least 3 times, and it's going to go through a sterile filter before it reaches a customer. That's just how I roll. So if you're trying to do it on flour, there are methods. They do degrade the flour in minimal ways, and you should be aware of that. And there are customers who don't like to have irradiated, ozonated products. Especially ozonated, because it makes things taste a little bit different. Usually some people can tell the difference. So, but yeah, they exist. It's possible. And, unless Alina would say different, I think it's also safe.
We haven't seen anything to the contrary of, but we don't know exactly what everybody's using because there's not like a list of acceptable remediation, processes. But definitely, if you're going to use a remediation process, definitely verify and validate it that, as to the best of your ability, with, all the other tests that labs offer that aren't mandated that could help you figure that out.
So we're a little over time. As a panel, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us and listening to us talk about things that we are obviously passionate about. And I'd like to turn it over to Brian here to close us out.
Wow. Well, fantastic. Thank you all so much for emphasizing the importance of already existing standard development organizations and how our industry specifically can get involved in the process for creating these standards within the cannabis space. I was really appreciative of all of your all's time and efforts over the last few weeks developing this session and delivering such an amazing educational offering for all of our members and supporters. Once again, I think that all of the committee insights sessions that have been put on by your all's committee in particular this whole term have been absolutely fantastic. So thank you all so much, Tiffany, Jim, Luke, and Alina, for presenting today's amazing session. And additionally, thank all of our audience members as well for all of the informed and engaged questions that really led the conversation to another level during the Q&A segment. We had a lot of very pointed and detailed questions for our panel to sink their teeth into, which I think everyone in the audience was very appreciative of. So huge thank you and shout out once again to the members of our panel. Everybody inside the audience, love to lead you all in a big virtual round of applause. If you enjoyed today's session, raise your hand in the audience pool. All of our panelists will get to see some really cool pop-up notifications to get that feedback. Yeah, awesome. Half dozen already. Fantastic. And then stick around for the next few moments. As always, we're going to close out today's session by giving you all a quick preview of some upcoming sessions and then leaving the room open for a few moments for you all to directly engage with any of the panelists as you all see fit. You can use the direct message feature within the chat room, or as mentioned by a number of the panelists throughout the conversation, you can reference all of their contact information inside of that PDF document that our team has been periodically inserting into the chat room. If you have any follow-up that you would like to coordinate specifically and individually with either Tiffany, Jim, Lucas, or Alina, please do not hesitate to. All right. And with that, thank you all so much for participating in another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. A huge thank you once again to all the members of our panel for presenting today's fantastic session, along with all of our audience members, and most importantly, our member business owners, which make our work possible each and every day. Please complete the attendee survey after leaving the meeting room to gain immediate access to our presentation files. And then do note that all NCIA members receive exclusive 30-day access to formatted video recordings of all of our Industry Essentials educational webinars, first posted in our members-only community platform, NCIA Connect. I see I think 2 open questions and maybe 1 or 2 that have come into the chat room over the last few minutes. We'll carry on today's conversation with all of our members inside of NCIA Connect later this week. So stay on the lookout for our session to be posted and those outstanding questions to be posted alongside of it in the Industry Essentials webinar community of NCIA Connect. All right. As always, we'll leave you all with this end of event credit sequence highlighting the 30+ member businesses that participated in this afternoon's session, alongside some lo-fi audio stylings by yours truly. If you don't see your company included, that just means that you need to head to the cannabisindustry.org/join following today's program to join the movement for a responsible and equitable cannabis industry. Enjoy, and we'll hopefully see you again later today for another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. See you all then.